In this video, we're going to hone in and specifically focus in on c-betting our strong value hands. And this video is really going to be primarily composed of hand history reviews, but I wanted to start off with just this one PowerPoint slide to get you to understand that when we have a strong value hand, we're not always going to be c-betting for 3 or 2 streets. Sometimes we're going to be c-betting for 1 street. So depending upon everything that we talked about in this course, combined with the relative and absolute strength of your hand, we can look to extract either 1, 2, or 3 streets of value. And so if we think about it, a 1 street value type of hand is typically going to be an okay strong hand, such as top pair with good kicker. 2 streets is either going to be a medium strength hand that turns into a strong value hand, or a strong value hand that turns into a medium strength hand. So for example, let's say that we flop an okay straight on the flop. We bet the flop, we bet the turn, and by the time we get to the river, we have a medium strength hand that we can no longer bet for value. Maybe a flush comes in, maybe a stronger straight comes in, but we can no longer bet that for 3 streets. And vice versa, let's say that we have a medium strength hand or potentially a drawing hand that turns into a strong value hand where we check the flop and then we delayed c-bet the turn in the river. Again, that's going to be 2 streets of values right there instead of 3. And then 3 streets of value, well, that's going to be our strong flushes, our strong straights, our sets, our 2 pair. And against certain opponents, really bad opponents, just 1 pair, top pair with a good kicker. So again, it's not really just as cut and dry as all this right here, because we have to think about every single thing that we've talked about in this course in terms of all the different criteria, the board texture, the relative hand strength, our opponent's playing style, in-game dynamics, effective stack sizes. So there's a lot to think about. So with that said, let's go ahead and let's jump over to some hand history reviews and let's talk about c-betting strong value hands. All right, so let's take a look at our first hand where we have pocket sixes, and some things I want you to think about as we go through this are our c-betting factors, which I just typed up in Notepad real quick. So we have to consider the board texture, our relative hand strength, the number of opponents that we're playing against, our position, our equity in the hand, our vulnerability of our hand, barrel potential, which really doesn't apply to strong value hands unless we have a strong value hand that also has some equity to improve to a better hand, our effective stack sizes, and our opponent's playing style. Now, let's go ahead and let's get started with this hand. I'm not going to turn on the HUD stats because I want you to just think about this hand from how our opponents are reacting pre-flop and post-flop. So let's go ahead and let's get started. So we have pocket sixes, we're under the gun, and you notice down here, this opponent in the cutoff, they posted what is called their dead blind. So what the dead blind is when somebody comes to the table as a new player and they don't want to wait till the big blind, and they go ahead and they elect to post their what we call their dead blind. So it can be in any position where you're not in the blinds and they just want to play right now. Couple of things to notice with this opponent is their stack size. You'll notice that they came in with a $20 stack, so they're playing 80 big blinds. That tells us that they're potentially a recreational opponent. And number 2, they're posting their dead blind, which is typically something a good player won't do. They'll wait until they get to the big blind and then they'll post their blind. So this opponent is on the fishier side. Now, of course, we're going to open raise pocket sixes at 25 and L and under the gun. And so I like to make it $1 instead of my standard 3 big blinds, which would be 75 cents, because we have this opponent down here that is posting their dead blind. We get a fold from middle position. This opponent elects to call. We have an opponent here that is playing, I wouldn't really call it deep stack. They have a little bit over 100 big blinds. They make the call. Small blind makes the call, and we get a fold from big blind. And small blind is playing a little on the small side, but again, maybe they just didn't re-top back up yet. So let's go ahead and let's go to the flop. The flop is a really good flop for us. We end up flopping a bottom set on a fairly wet board texture, and small blind checks. Action is on us. What do we do here? So let's go ahead. Let's pull up our criteria. So the board texture is fairly wet, right? There are straight draws and there are flush draws. So there are all sorts of combo hand draws that can draw to a straight. So we have hands like ace queen, we have queen 10, we have queen 9, we have a plethora of hands that can draw to a straight draw. We have hands that are combo draw, which are going to be either a pair plus a draw. Now in this situation, we could have a pair of kings with a backdoor flush draw. We could have a pair of kings with a backdoor straight draw. And then there's just the straight flush draw as well. So there are a lot of spade draws that our opponents can have, from weaker aces that are suited, straight draws that are suited to give them a straight plus a flush draw, and just hands such as suited one gappers, suited connectors that are flush draws as well. And then of course we just have hands that are top pair, a king X hand as well. So there are a lot of hands that can call that are worse than ours. And if we think about the preflop action, the only hands that we lose to are sets of jacks and sets of kings, and we expect our opponents to 3-bet those. So we can really pretty much push those out of their range for the most part, unless they're really passive. Maybe a set of jacks, but really never a set of kings. Now, in terms of our relative hand strength, we know that we pretty much have the effective nuts here. Against multiple different opponents, we are incentivized to bet on this board texture. We're definitely out of position, so we definitely want to lead out with our c-bet. Our equity is definitely going to be good here, but we're vulnerable to a lot of draws. And stack sizes as well, they're pretty standard here. So we go ahead and we fire out a continuation bet on the bigger side here, and that's because this is a wet board texture. We're betting for value plus protection, and we don't want to give our opponents a good price to call, and we know that they will potentially call a larger size bet with a lot of good drawing hands. We get a fold from opponent number 2 or villain number 2 in the cutoff. We get a call from the button, and we get a fold from the small blind. Go to the turn. Really not a great turn card for us. So if we think about it, straight draws got there, flush draws got there. Really not a great card for us. And the question is, do we check or do we bet? So let's go ahead and let's actually show the HUD stats. And let's see if we have HUD stats on our opponent. And if we take a look at this, this really gives us a lot of additional insights into our opponent. So the person that we want to focus on is villain number 3, because, well, that's the only person we're playing against. And if we look at it, their VPIP is 92, their PFR is 0, and they are folding to 33% of continuation bets on the flop and only half of them on the turn. So this opponent here, knowing this information now, we definitely can bet for value because this is an uber fish. This is a very loose passive opponent that is weak loose, meaning they are calling with pretty much close to 100% of a range. Yes, it's only 12 hands, but after 12 hands, we can tell that they are very loose passive. And so we can get value from all sorts of weaker hands. King X, Jack X. Yeah, sometimes they're going to have a flush, sometimes they're going to have a straight, but more often than not, they're going to have a pair or a straight draw or a flush draw or a combo draw. So we elect to fire a second barrel. And the reason for sizing down a little bit here is we extract value from this opponent. We target the weaker portion of their range as well. So we want our opponent to continue with Jack X hands, King X hands that don't have much equity to improve. And if they raise this turn, then we can bet fold, and we don't lose as much if we sized up our bet. So on the flop, we sized up our flop C bet, but on the turn we sized down a little bit. If this was a blank, we could potentially size up and hope to get called by this opponent. But on the turn, when they can improve, we size down, so we risk less when we face a check raise here. Our opponent calls. We go to the river. The river is the best card in the world for us here. We now have the effective nuts. We're not really worried about our opponent having a bigger full house here. And so, well, what's our plan? Our plan is to get stacks in. And the other thing too is even with sizing down our bet on the turn, we can still easily get stacks in on the river. So if you notice, right, we bet a half pot size bet on the turn, and we still have a much smaller size bet left in our stack compared to the size of the pot. So we decide to go all in. Our opponent calls, And let's go ahead and show his hand. And he ended up actually having probably the best possible hand he could have had in his range here. And we ended up getting really lucky on the river here by hitting the 9 of hearts. And so this is a perfect example of betting 3 streets of value. Now against other opponents, that might be a lot tighter, more of a nit or a weak tight opponent, we're probably going to check back this turn instead of betting this turn. But when you're playing against a 92/0 and they are folding to 33% of the c-bets on the flop and 50% on the turn, then definitely we need to go ahead and bet this turn. Now, it's unfortunate for him. He had top pair, top kicker on the flop with the nut flush draw. He turns the nut flush draw, and being in a position where I'm betting and betting and betting, I understand the check call line because he's not really incentivized to raise the turn because he has the effective nuts and he wants me to bet with worth. But his biggest issue here was how he played pre-flop. So pre-flop, he should have 3-bet. And if you 3-bet to a standard size, depending upon how these opponents react, I may or may not call with pocket sixes out of position under the gun. It really all depends on how the action occurred. So if he 3-bet pre-flop, he probably takes down a decent pot pre-flop. Maybe he gets called by me and we end up getting stacks in on the flop or the turn in a 3-bet pot. But when I have the lead against this type of opponent, I'm going to bet on this run out. All right, so let's go ahead and let's take a look at another hand. All right, so in this hand, we have pocket queens, and I am going to turn on the HUDs and actually have it on, so I guess we don't have any stats on anybody. So let's go ahead and let's take a look at the action. Again, we're playing 25 NL. We get an open raise from middle position. Pocket queens, we're obviously going to 3-bet here for value and folds back around to the initial raiser who decides to call our 3-bet out of position. Again, we know nothing about our opponent other than they are playing a larger than 100 big blind stack. And that really doesn't tell us too much, unfortunately. But again, we have pocket queen, so we're obviously going to be 3-betting for value. In a 3-bet pot, we end up flopping top set. Our opponent checks. The action is on us. So what do we do here? So this is, again, a semi-wet board texture. It's a rainbow flop. If we think about 3-bet calling ranges, there's going to be a lot of Broadway combos that are non-paired Broadway combos. So we have ace-king offsuit. We have ace-queen. Yes, we block it. But there still are some combos of that left in the deck. So we do have some ace-queen offsuits that our opponent can have. They could have ace-10. They could have king-jack. They'd have king-queen, even though we blocked that. They could have ace-jack. So there are a fair amount of different combos as well as king-jack that they could have within their range. They could have pocket jacks. They could have pocket tens. They could have pocket sixes. And they could have a plethora of other hands. So the question is here, do we c-bet or do we not c-bet? And I think this could go either way. So if our opponent is a decent opponent, we could potentially check back for deception and still play our hand. If our opponent is a fish and they're a calling station, we definitely want to bet for value here, hoping that they call with gutter draws, hoping that they call with a pair of jacks where they don't believe that we have a queen X hand, hopefully that they call with king queen or ace queen, some 10x hands as well, and even worse sets. So it really depends on our opponent. We could either delay c-bet the turn or hope that they lead out on the turn, or we could just bet here on the flop. Now, I elect to bet, and like I said, it really depends on our opponent because our hand really isn't that vulnerable. Hands such as open and straight draws are only going to improve around 16% of the time on the turn. So we're really not incentivized to have to fast play our hand for protection here because our hand is so invulnerable to a lot of turn cards. But we do elect to bet here, so I'm assuming that I must have had a read that this opponent is on the fishier side and a bit of a calling station. Our opponent elects to call. The turn is the king of hearts. And yes, that does bring in the straight for jack 9 and ace jack. But for a lot of the hands that our opponent could have, if they had a hand like king queen or 10 king, now they end up having 2 pair. If they have a hand like queen jack or king jack or ace jack, well, ace jack does get the straight, but the other combos of 10 jack, queen jack, and king jack, these are now a pair plus a straight draw. So even though this looks like it's a really bad scare card, it's not too bad. Our opponent checks, we lead out on the turn. And again, we lead out on the turn here because he can have so many worse hands that can call here. Again, if we get raised here, I don't know if I fold here, to be honest. I'd have to know the in-game dynamics of this opponent. And based upon what I know about this opponent, I'm either going to call or fold. So without knowing any HUD stats, again, we really don't know the optimal line here. He does raise. He does decide to go all in. We do make the call. So we go to the river. The flush comes in. Again, the straight's already there. So let's see what our opponent had, and they had king jack. So again, I must have had a really good read on this opponent to make this call here, because it really depends on your opponent whether you can call that turn bet or not. If they're on the looser side, if they're on the fishier side, if they're more aggressive, then yeah, we can make that call. If they're on the nittier side, if they're more weak type passive, then we're probably bet folding that turn. We're probably sizing down our bet rather than betting on the larger side. So this is a good example of, based upon your opponent, you can either bet 2 streets or 3 streets of value here, or even potentially even 1 street. So going back to the beginning of the hand and going to the turn, against certain opponents, against certain ranges, we may only be betting 1 street, but for the most part, we will be betting 2 streets. And then, we got all in here on this river. Depending upon the river run out, we may only be betting 2 streets. So like I said, nothing is entirely straightforward. It really depends on the hand. All right, let's go ahead and let's take a look at another hand. All right, so in this hand, we have ace jack offsuit. We're in the cutoff. So action folds around to us. We put in a standard raise. We are playing 5-0 on this hand. Get a fold from the button. We get a call from small blind, and we get a fold from the big blind. And if we take a look at this opponent, and these stats are actually against the player pool, so it's not against this particular opponent, and I don't believe this allows me to show the stats for this current session. This is only going to be for the player pool, but the player pool here is VPIP of 40, PFR of 11%. So in general, this 5-0 player pool that I'm playing against, they are loose passive. So on this flop, we end up flopping top 2 pair. On a really wet board texture, opponent checks. Action is on us. So what do you do here? Well, you definitely need to bet. And we are betting because our hand is really vulnerable to a lot of bad turn cards. And also, our equity is going to be diminished on the turn on any Broadway card, any club. So we are incentivized to bet here. And of course, the relative hand strength, we have top 2 pair. Really, the only thing we're worried about are sets and our opponent flopping the flush. Everything else we beat. And if we take a look at this, we have a loose passive opponent in this seat for the player pool. So of course, we bet this turn and our opponent folds. So this is a position where we definitely want to bet the turn. And I know that the hand ended there, but I wanted to make sure that you understand that it's imperative that we bet this flop. Now, if we face a raise, again, it really depends on our opponent. So we know that this opponent is loose passive. It really depends on the size of the raise and how much equity we have, we think, the effective stack sizes, how good our implied odds are, and if we think we can call and reevaluate the turn. So again, if we do face a raise on this flop, based on the type of opponent, we're either going to call or fold and reevaluate the turn. So let's go ahead and let's take a look at another hand. All right, so in this hand, we have ace jack offsuit again. This time we are playing under the gun and we open raise. We get a call from middle position. Everybody else folds. We go to the flop and we flop the nut straight. So the question is, do we bet here or do we check? So we're first to act. Is it imperative that we bet? And what's the best EV player? What's the highest EV play here? So again, it depends on our opponent. I turn the HUD stats off because I don't have specific HUD stats on this player, just the player pool. So the thing is that this hand really isn't that vulnerable. yes, an ace or a jack on the turn really sucks because our opponent could end up hitting the nut straight with us and we could end up chopping. But if we think about it, there are 3 aces and there are 3 jacks left in the deck. So there's a total of 6 cards where our opponent can approve. And if they do improve, they would potentially be chopping with us if they had an ace X or jack X hand that would hit the nut straight on the turn. So if we think about that, there's 6 cards, 6 times 2 means 12% of the time they're going to improve if they have an ace or jack, where they potentially will make the exact same ace high straight as us on the turn. So we're not really worried about that from a mathematical perspective. So if we think about this, well, relative hand strength, we have the nuts. Is our hand that vulnerable on a lot of turns? No, not really. This is going to be one of those way ahead or way behind situations on a board like this. Yes, it's coordinated, but it is not something where it is a two-tone or a monotone board where there is a flush draw. It's only the straight draw and a backdoor flush draw. So are we incentivized to bet this, or is the EV going to be higher if we check? And in this situation, I think heads up, the EV is going to be higher if we check, because if we do check here, we can potentially induce our opponent to bet a draw. So if they have a jack or an ace, or if they have a king or a queen, they may be inclined to bet here. And also, if we check and they check back, again, they may be able to improve on the turn to a worse hand. And if we think about it, if there is a jack on the board, what if they have a 9? Well, again, they improve to a lower straight. They could be a bad player. We don't know. We don't know enough about this opponent. So I think the EV of checking is going to be higher than betting here. So we do elect to check here. Our opponent checks back. On the turn, it is a 8. And on the turn, we decide to delay c-bet the turn. We don't really size up. We size down to target the weaker portion of our opponent's range to get them to call with a draw or a draw plus a pair. And they do fold. So this is one of those situations where even though our hand is strong enough to c-bet 3 streets of value, on a drier board texture, the EV of checking here is typically going to be higher even though they did fold here. And remember, EV is in the long term. On average, how often would it make more money to check here and delay c-bet versus leading out on this flop? Now against multiple opponents, we'd be more incentivized to bet the flop because the odds of one opponent calling or 2 opponents calling is going to be much higher versus in a heads-up situation. So I wanted to show this example as a situation where we would delay c-bet. And a better example, rather than this, even though we do have the nuts, is a really dry board texture where we flop a set and where it's top set as well, where it's very hard for our opponent to even call with top pair. So anyways, I wanted to show you that one. Let's go ahead and let's take a look at another hand. All right, so we have another hand, and this one is quite an interesting hand. So we have 8-7 suited. We are playing 3 ways. I'm on the button, obviously going to be opening this hand on the button. We get a fold from small blind, big blind, defends. We go to the flop, and the flop is a paired board with the 5-5-4. We do have a gutter straight draw. We have 2 overs, but our hand is one of those crappier drawing hands where heads up, our opponent checks. So we elect to check back with a really crappy drawing hand here. Really, we're only drawing to a 6, a 7, or 8. So our equity really isn't that great. So we check back and we end up turning the straight. So one of those 4 outs, our 8% equity does improve to the straight on the turn. Our opponent checks again. Now we lead out because we had a drawing hand, a really weak drawing hand that turned into a very strong value hand. So this is one of those situations where you go from medium strength to a strong hand. And so we bet the turn, we get a call from our opponent, and then the river really isn't that great of a river card. So the flush gets there. If our opponent has a 4x hand, well, they just hit a boat. So there is that. And we think about both of those. Yeah, they could potentially have a backdoor flush draw, but they could potentially have a 4x hand, and they could be slow playing a 5x hand as well. And so the question is, can we bet this river for value? And in this situation, I think it really depends on our opponent. Is our opponent going to look us up with an ace high? Are they going to look us up with a 6x hand? Are they going to look us up with a lower straight as well? So maybe they ended up turning the lower straight with 2-3, or potentially not. So I don't think that we can get a lot of value. And again, it really depends on our opponent if they're going to look us up with ace high or 6x. But again, the flush got there, full houses got there. So we elect to check back. And this is a situation where we have a weak hand that goes to a strong hand that goes to a medium strength hand. And this is, in this situation against this opponent, I decide to check back and they end up having 3-10 here. So on the turn, they ended up getting the open-ended straight draw. So 3, 4, 5, 6, and they were looking for either a deuce or a 7. And again, are we going to get value from this specific hand? No, we're not. So we end up checking back with our hand that went from a weak hand to a strong hand, back to a medium strength hand on this river. All right, so let's take a look at one more hand, and I want to show in this example a hand that starts off as a strong value hand that turns into a medium strength hand. So let's go ahead and let's take a look. So we are under the gun with Queen Jack offsuit. Well, we're actually in middle position because we're only playing 5-handed. We open raise, folds round to the big blind, who is playing deep stacked. They end up calling and defending in the big blind. We end up flopping top pair with a decent kicker. And so with Queen Jack, I say decent kicker because, well, there is Jack King, that's a better kicker, and there is Jack Ace, which is also a better kicker. So we let out here on the flop with a c-bet when we get a check from the big blind for a standard sizing of around 2/3 of a pot size bet. And our opponent calls. So this is what I would consider a semi-dry board texture. Yeah, there are straight draws. So there is 9-7, there is 9-queen that we block. So there are some hands that are drawing hands here. And we do also have our opponent that may be calling with a pair of 10s or a pair of 9s. It could be slow playing a set here as well. Or they could be just floating out of position with some overcards, maybe a king high or an ace high. So the range is fairly wide here. The turn is a turn card that isn't really that great for us. Our opponent does check. The action is on us now. And the question is, can we bet for value here? And the answer is it depends. And not knowing anything about our opponent, I turn the HUD stats off on purpose. But just assuming that this is an unknown opponent, this would fall into our turn checking range because our hand went from a top pair hand with an okay kicker, which is a decently strong hand, to now middle pair on the turn where opponent could potentially have some ace-x hands within their range. And also they could have hands like king jack or ace jack as well that they're defending that we also lose to. So on the turn we elect to check because again, this is really one of those type of hands where it's not a 3 street of value type of hand because it's no longer that strong of a hand. And then our opponent checks on the river. And the question is, can we thin value bet here? And against certain opponents, yes, we can thin value bet here. But again, we need to know something about our opponent. And I turn the HUD stats off on purpose because we need to think about this. So against a bad opponent, that is a calling station that is going to call with weaker jack hands. And there really aren't that many because we now lose to Jack 10. We lose to Jack 8. It would have to be a hand that is Jack 7 down to Jack Deuce or Jack 9. We lose to all the other Jack combos. And also, what they call with a pair of 8s here with a third worst hand, and what they call with a pair of 10s. How would they get a 10x hand on the river? They could have King 10 potentially. They could have Queen 10 potentially. But again, there aren't that many hands that we can get value from here on this river situation. So we check back for a showdown value. And our opponent end up showing down pocket 9s. They do have pocket 9s in this situation. Pocket 9s is one of the hands that we probably don't get value from. So this is a good example of one street of value. A hand that goes from an okay strength, strong value hand down to a medium strength hand that we can't get value from. And I wanted to make sure that I ended up talking about that. So we ended up talking about hands that we would get 3 streets of value from, hands that we would get 2 streets of value from, and hands that we could get 1 street of value from. And I could go on just showing you examples for hours. And that's the great thing about strong, medium, drawing, and weak hands, is that this game is so dynamic that we can have a strong hand that goes to a medium strength hand that turns into a weak hand, or vice versa, a weak hand or drawing hand that turns into a medium strength or a strong value hand. And there are so many unique post-flop situations that we need to consider all these factors here. And these factors are going to allow us to determine how we should play our hands when we're using our basic strategy where we are betting our strong value hands, we're betting our drawing hands, we're checking our medium strength, and we're checking our weaker hands. And of course, this video honed in on the strong value hands. So just make sure that when you're looking to determine whether you can value bet or not with your strong value hands, make sure you consider all of our c-betting factors, or at least the ones that are relevant in that situation, and determine if you can c-bet 1, 2, or 3 streets of value. So what we're going to do in the next video is we're going to repeat this, but we're going to take a look at our medium strength hands where our default strategy is checking them. So let's go ahead and let's jump over to our next video where we're going to be talking about medium strength value hands.